my screen for you there. Okay, so thinking back to the other day, we were talking about the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, providing us with motor output signaling to things like cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands, and which we'd already talked before back at the beginning of the units. We learned that the two divisions, there's a third, enteric, but the two majors that we talk about at this point in the semester are the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Sympathetic, which we learned, produces a fight or flight response, and does so to do things to make us physically active, whether that's as drastic as running from a bear or fighting a bear, or just going for a jog, which people like to do. The opposite division of that is the parasympathetic division, which produces a rest and digest response. Okay, what you guys will be exhibiting right now in the case of resting conditions. So resting heart rate, might be digesting the food that you just had for lunch, and so on and so forth. Okay, we talked about there are two other terms to describe those two divisions. The sympathetic nervous system, we learned, also goes by the term thoracolumbar division, and that's because it uses the thoracic and then part of the lumbar region of the spinal cord. Signals come out typically, and synapsing occurs right in this trunk or chain of ganglia right outside the spinal column. And then the second neuron, the postganglionic neuron, carries the signal the rest of the way to things like the lungs and the heart that you can see there in the picture. On the left side of the page, you can see the parasympathetic nervous system, what we can also describe as the craniosacral division, utilizes 4 cranial nerves. So there's where the cranio, and then the sacral region of the spinal cord. So that's where that term comes from. And as we can see, there is no chain associated with the parasympathetic nervous system. So I kind of posed the question before we left class the other day. How does, for example, your heart know when to speed up when the sympathetic nervous system is active, and how does the heart know when to slow down when the parasympathetic nervous system is active? Well, I think I pointed this out. I don't know if I really did or not, but if I didn't, it's all because of what we see here versus down here. The release of different neurotransmitters is going to be the big regulator and difference between the two. And so that's what we'll start with here today. As noted previously, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems have dual innervation, meaning they innervate many of the same target organs. So not all organs, but things like your heart and your stomach, they typically are going to have signals coming thanks to nerves for the sympathetic nervous system. There's also nerves carrying signals for the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, so how do these two sympathetic, parasympathetic nerves produce contrasting effects on the organ? Kind of two things. Okay, number one, the different neurotransmitters that are secreted at the target organ. Okay, so in other words, what we just saw, norepinephrine for the sympathetic nervous system, acetylcholine for the parasympathetic, and then number two, the target organ has different receptors for those given neurotransmitters. So in other words, the target organ has to be able to receive and accept those neurotransmitters. So it's got to have receptors specific for it. So we're going to talk here for the next couple of slides about neurotransmitters and receptors, starting with the one I just mentioned and one that we introduced last week, acetylcholine. Acetylcholine, capital A, capital C, lowercase h, released by what we call cholinergic fibers or cholinergic neurons. So pretty hopefully easy to remember, acetylcholine released by cholinergic fibers. Those cholinergic neurons or fibers include all sympathetic and parasympathetic preganglionic neurons. So remember, preganglionic would be the first neurons, whereas postganglionic neurons are the second neurons. Okay, going back to this illustration. Okay, looking at the bottom 3 illustrations, we see preganglionic, preganglionic, preganglionic. It doesn't matter if it's sympathetic for these two pictures or parasympathetic, it's always going to be acetylcholine, acetylcholine, acetylcholine. What we also see, and this is something we'll kind of talk more about later in the semester, when we talk about scudder muscles, is that acetylcholine is released by the somatic motor neurons that trigger our muscles to contract. All right. So acetylcholine, 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 acetylcholine. It's also going to be released by sympathetic postganglionic neurons that innervate most sweat glands, okay, which is unique because typically when it's the second neuron, postganglionic neuron of the sympathetic nervous system, it's not acetylcholine. The only place where we see the sympathetic postganglionic neurons secreting this acetylcholine is at the sweat glands. I don't really know why sweat glands are why, where we see acetylcholine released by the sympathetic postganglionic neurons, but that's what it is. Okay. And for the parasympathetic nervous system, not only is it the preganglionic neurons secreting acetylcholine, but it's also the postganglionic neurons. So going back once again to this illustration down at the bottom, acetylcholine is released here and it's released here. Okay, so it's twice in a row. Okay, whereas here for the sympathetic, it's acetylcholine and then NE for norepinephrine. Okay. Now, the receptors that receive and accept acetylcholine are called cholinergic receptors. They're integral proteins in the postsynaptic plasma membrane of target cells or target organs. And this includes muscarinic and nicotinic. Those are two kind of types. Muscarinic, that word kind of sounds like muscle at the beginning. And that's where you find it on cardiac smooth muscle, on smooth muscle, and then not a muscle, but obviously what we call glands. And then nicotinic kind of sounds like the word nicotine. Okay, but these receptors are found on the plasma membrane of dendrites and cell bodies of both sympathetic and parasympathetic postganglionic neurons, the chromaffin cells of the adrenal medulla, and at the neuromuscular junction. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead a couple slides, and we can see those different receptors shown here with three very similar illustrations to what we saw the other day. At the top, we've got parasympathetic nervous system, and then at the bottom, we've got sympathetic nervous system and sympathetic nervous system specifically for sweat glands. Okay, looking here, we see once again acetylcholine released by the first neuron, no matter what, if it's sympathetic or parasympathetic. If it's parasympathetic, it's acetylcholine and acetylcholine. Okay, the receptors that are on the postganglionic neurons, no matter what, if we're looking para or sympathetic, those are what we just learned are called nicotinic receptors. Okay, whereas the ones that are on the effector cells, like this, which looks like a smooth muscle cell, could be a cardiac muscle cell, or maybe even a gland cell, it would be a muscarinic receptor. Muscarinic receptors would also be on the cells of sweat glands, which, as you just learned, acetylcholine is released by the sympathetic postganglionic neurons that innervate sweat glands. Okay, this is a kind of rare instance where the sympathetic nervous system releases acetylcholine and again acetylcholine, because typically the sympathetic nervous system does what's shown here in the middle picture. Acetylcholine is first released, and then the second neuron releases norepinephrine. Now, at the bottom there, it looks like the letters A and B, but that's actually alpha and beta. Alpha, you can see it's got this little bit of a tail up here. Kind of always looks like a fish to me. And then beta has a little extra tail. Those are Greek symbols, Greek letters, I guess. Okay, let's first talk about norepinephrine, which was just shown on that next slide. Secreted by nearly all sympathetic postganglionic neurons. The only exception, once again, are those postganglionic neurons innervating sweat glands. But anywhere else, whether this is like at the heart, whether this is at the stomach, okay, if it's the sympathetic nervous system, that second neuron is going to be releasing norepinephrine. We learned the other day that norepinephrine is not only released by neurons, but it's also released from the adrenal medulla whenever we have that fight or flight response kicked in from what we call chromaffin cells. Okay, but along with norepinephrine, our chromaffin cells of the adrenal medulla are also going to release epinephrine. Okay, what we commonly call adrenaline, and if you wanted to, you could call norepinephrine noradrenaline. Okay, in that case, those chemicals are getting dumped into the bloodstream. So we'd say that here they'd be released as a hormone, okay, because they're being dumped into the bloodstream. It's still the same chemical here as far as norepinephrine goes as it is here. Okay, it's just who's releasing it and where it's going. That makes it either a neurotransmitter like it is here or a hormone like it is here. Okay. Now, any neuron that releases norepinephrine is called an adrenergic fiber or adrenergic neuron. So that would be like that one that I just showed you. Okay. As I just mentioned, norepinephrine can be either released as a neurotransmitter by those sympathetic postganglionic neurons, or it's released as a hormone from the adrenal medulla. Whereas when we talk about epinephrine, we're describing it being released as a hormone because it's getting dumped in the blood from that adrenal medulla. Both norepinephrine and epinephrine bind to receptors called adrenergic receptors. So it's adrenergic fibers that release norepinephrine, adrenergic receptors that receive it. Okay, and same thing for epinephrine. We find them on visceral effectors innervated by most sympathetic postganglionic axons. And so that would be what we see here for this effector cell on the next page. Okay, now there's two major types of adrenergic receptors, alphas and betas. Okay, and there's actually subcategories of these. But typically, alpha adrenergic receptors have excitatory effects, like an example here where blood vessels constrict when epi and norepi bind to it. Blood vessel constriction is where blood vessels are like, when you kink a garden hose, it pinches it shut. And that's going to happen when the muscle in the wall of the blood vessels, that smooth muscle contracts. So it's a contraction that makes it excitatory. Okay. Beta adrenergic receptors can have different effects depending upon where you're at in the body. For example, the first one here, dilating smooth muscle in the pulmonary system, meaning we're going to increase airflow into and out of the lungs, involving what we call beta 2 receptors. This is an inhibitory response. Okay, and I say that because the smooth muscle is relaxing. So the muscle's not contracting, it's relaxing. That's an inhibitory response. And that's great. We don't think inhibitory is a bad thing. Okay, by opening up your airways more, you can get more air in and out of your lungs. It's a good thing. Okay, especially when we are, fighting and flighting. Okay, down at the bottom, stronger and faster heartbeat shows an example of a excitatory effect, okay, or an excitatory response. In the case of the beta 1 receptors that are in our heart, okay, when epi and norepi bind to that set of receptors, the heart beats more forcefully and at a rapid rate. Both of those are excitatory responses. So does that make sense how and why I said they can have different effects in different parts of the body? Okay, good. Now, as far as this set of illustrations here on the next page, I like it because it really, gives you a good view of the different receptors, the different neurotransmitters. As you guys know, those of you who are taking anatomy, I love pictures in anatomy class. I don't necessarily do that nearly as much in this class, but if I go back to this slide, which I've referenced several times, not only today, but the other day, okay, this is a rare instance where I'm telling you right now, there's a good chance you're going to see one or two of these images next week. Okay, so what that means is you should be able to just recognize what division of the nervous system each illustration is showing you. Okay, at the top, this is one neuron going all the way to skeletal muscle, so that has to be the somatic nervous system. Okay, the second picture is showing you the sympathetic nervous system, where you have a short preganglionic and then a long postganglionic. The third picture, is another picture showing you the sympathetic nervous system, and you can see what we call the adrenal medulla in the middle. If you show the adrenal medulla, you have to be dealing with the sympathetic nervous system. And then down at the bottom, it's a long pre and a short post. So the first neuron's really long, the second is really short. That's going to tell you that this is parasympathetic. Okay. Aside from recognizing which division of the nervous system's illustrated, you might also have to know which neurotransmitter is being released where. Okay. So, if I were to put this image on the exam and say, which neurotransmitter is being released here, or if I was looking right here, I'd say which neurotransmitter is being released here. You should be able to recognize that. The good thing is, there's a good chance acetylcholine would be your answer. Okay? It might not be the correct answer, but if you don't know the answer, if you guess acetylcholine, it might not be a bad, guess, just because look at the page. Acetylcholine here, acetylcholine here, acetylcholine, acetylcholine, acetylcholine. Something like 80% of what you see here on this page is the release of acetylcholine. The only places it's not is here and here. Make sense? Okay. So hopefully you just can recognize, okay, that's sympathetic. That means it's not acetylcholine here. But if you can't, you know, you can guess, you might get it right. Now, last week I mentioned that certain medicines and chemicals can interact with neurotransmitters and the receptors that receive those neurotransmitters. And a large variety of drugs and natural products can either selectively activate or block cholinergic or adrenergic receptors. We can throw them into two categories, those that are an agonist and those that are an antagonist. An agonist is a substance that binds to and then activates a receptor, which basically means that it's going to mimic the effect of the natural neurotransmitter or the hormone. So in other words, basically, it's a chemical that instead of being acetylcholine, maybe it binds to this receptor and triggers that cell to do whatever that acetylcholine would do naturally. Okay, so it acts like the neurotransmitter, it just actually isn't. Okay, an example of this is phenylephrine, which is found in and causes or helps with nasal decongestion. You guys ever heard of Mucinex before? Phenylephrine is one of the leading chemicals in Mucinex. Okay, if you are suffering from sinus pressure and a cold and you're, you know, like draining mucus all the time, you might take Mucinex or something like that. You might find on the box phenylephrine listed there. What it does, it constricts blood vessels in the nasal mucosa. So the blood vessels that line the inside of your nose become blocked and thus reduces the production of mucus and relieves your nasal congestion. And the opposite of an agonist is what an antagonist does, a substance that blocks or binds to the receptor and then prevents the natural neurotransmitter or hormone from exerting its effect. So essentially, it occupies the space so that like norepinephrine can't bind to the actual cell and thus produce a response. Okay, you guys have ever heard of beta blockers before? Okay, beta blockers are very commonly prescribed medicine. A lot of people are on them because there are a lot, unfortunately, of people with hypertension or high blood pressure. People that are at high risk for things like heart attack and stroke, a lot of times will be on beta blockers. It blocks those beta 1 receptors that I was just talking about in the heart. And that's going to prevent the action of epi and norepi, which, as we just learned, epi-norepi binding to beta 1 receptors increases heart rate and force of contraction. So if you can't bind epi-norepi to those beta 1 receptors, it reduces heart rate and force of contraction, and both of those are going to result in a subsequent decrease in blood pressure. So if you've ever heard beta blockers before, now you know what they actually do. Okay, next couple slides, I just want to talk specifics on what happens to specific parts of the body with the sympathetic and then the parasympathetic nervous systems are active. A lot of what you see here on this slide and the next slide should be pretty common sense, because I've been hammering you on fight or flight, rest and digest for the last week and a half. Once again, the sympathetic nervous system produces that fight or flight response. We don't just kick it in for nothing. It has to be elicited because of stress. So stress increases the sympathetic nervous system or enhances it, which enhances the fight or flight response. In order to fight off stress, whether that's as crazy as running from a bear or just, the stress of exercising, we need energy. And as we know, ATP is our body's energy. So we need to ramp up our production of ATP. Okay. Other things that we do, we dilate our pupils. We make it better to see. That helps us fight that bear off or run for, the jog that we're doing. We increase our heart rate and our blood pressure, so our blood flow is going to increase throughout the body. We dilate our airways so that we are breathing more oxygen in and getting more CO2 out. While we're doing these things, we're going to shut down blood flow to our kidneys and gastrointestinal tract. So in other words, we're not going to send blood to our kidneys to make urine. We're not going to help participate in digestion, because if you think of it like in a drastic situation, like encountering a bear, is it important to make pee? Is it important to digest your food if you are in that life and death situation? Obviously, the answer to that is no. So that allows us to then devote all of our most important resources, they're the things that are going to help us out. Okay, the things that work when we are in that fight or flight response are our skeletal muscles, our cardiac muscles, so we increase the blood supply to them. We're also going to be sending more blood to our liver and our adipose or fat tissue. And that's because in our liver, we store what we call glycogen. Okay, glycogen, we learned in our last unit, is the storage form of glucose. And if you break down your glycogen, that's what this process is called. We're going to talk more about that later on the semester. That increases your blood glucose levels. And really, I should put this phrase right there at the end of this sentence too. So if you wanted to write that out, it might not be a bad idea. By increasing blood glucose, that makes it available for ATP production. Okay. Adipose tissue is just a fancy term for your fat tissue. Okay. We increase the blood supply to that because what we're going to be doing at this point is breaking down our fat. That's what lipolysis is. And that allows us to use that fat for ATP production purposes as well. Okay, so those are kind of just short descriptions of what happens when the sympathetic nervous system is active. Let's now talk parasympathetic. Kind of 5 major things, if you can remember this, what is it, acronym SLUD. That will help you remember those 5 things. Some of those words probably are pretty easy to figure out, or you've already known them for a long time. One of them, I bet, might trip you up. I'll explain what each of them means in case you don't know. Okay, salivation would be the production of what? Saliva. Okay. Urination would be the production and release of urine. Digestion would be the breakdown of food. Defecation would be the release of that food that we have not absorbed. In other words, we're pooping. Anybody have any idea what lacrimation is?
Mother lactating?
That's a good guess, but no. That would be called lactation, actually.
Oh yeah, but I didn't know.
Your lacrimal glands are your tear glands. Okay. Just above our eyes are where you find your lacrimal glands. Lacrimation is the production of tears. Now, you guys are all demonstrating the rest and digest response. I don't see anybody sweating profusely, breathing rapidly, or anything like that. If I look around the room, I don't see anybody crying today. Hopefully that's the case again on Tuesday during the test. Does that mean you're not producing tears?
No.
No, you absolutely are in a rest and digest response. You're just not producing a ton. I know nobody likes this word, but we produce just enough tears to keep our eyes moist. Okay, just that word everybody hates to hear. Okay, you guys all probably experienced times where your eyes get dry and how uncomfortable that is. Okay, your lacrimal glands keep your eyes nice and wet. Okay, and then if we experience an emotional response and we produce a lot more, then we start crying. But that's something completely different than what I'm talking about right now. Okay. In other words, when our parasympathetic nervous system is active, we're conserving and restoring body energy. Our digestive and urinary functions are elevated, and our body functions supporting physical activity are depressed. Okay. So those are just kind of 2 slides describing kind of just general things that are happening. For some very specific descriptions, table 14 here is 15.4, excuse me, is on the next 2 slides. It's actually kind of a 3-part table. I've crammed the other 2 parts here on the following slide. It basically goes organ by organ and tells you specifically what the sympathetic nervous system does to it, what the parasympathetic nervous system does to it. But these 2 tables, I mean, it is very intense, a lot of information. I'm not going to directly drive anything from this and put it on the exam. Okay. A kind of simpler version of that is this illustration on the following page, which I will definitely ask you to know and may pull stuff from it on the exam. More likely I will pull stuff from this and put it on the exam. So make sure you can understand. On the left, it basically tells you what the parasympathetic division does to things like your eyes and your salivary glands. Whereas on the right, what the sympathetic nervous system does to those same organs. Notice for most things, like the heart and the lungs you see here, there's an arrow pointing for both divisions. So demonstrating once again what we called dual innervation. Most organs are innervated by both divisions. Not everything, for example, the liver, you don't see a green arrow pointing to it. Not everything has dual innervation, but most organs do. And I mentioned that earlier. Okay. So make sure you know this figure. I'm not going to put the figure itself, just the information from it. Okay, and then final slides here will be talking about everything kind of put together for these last several slides and what we call integration and control of autonomic functions. Okay. Thinking back to Tuesday, we talked about reflexes like the stretch reflex, elicited like when you sit on the table and you tap on the patellar tendon and your leg kicks out. Flexor withdrawal reflex, like when the guy stepped on a tack. Those were all described as somatic reflexes. Somatic reflexes involve skeletal muscle because that's what the somatic nervous system controls. Well, autonomic reflexes control your cardiac muscle, your smooth muscle, and your glands. Okay. And just like somatic reflexes, we have a reflex arc. This time we call them an autonomic reflex arc. Okay. And it's basically the same 5 components that we saw the other day: receptors, sensory neurons, integrating center, and the gray matter of either the brain or the spinal cord, and then motor neurons carrying the signal out to effectors. Okay. Well, in the case of autonomic reflexes, these play a lot more complicated roles in the body, something much more complex than like kicking your leg out when you tap the patellar tendon. I'm talking about regulating things like your blood pressure, digestion, urination. Some of these things we'll get into in great detail. For example, we'll spend a couple lectures during the cardiovascular system section of the semester talking about blood pressure, how it changes with like the heart and changes with blood vessels can regulate it. Obviously, we'll talk about digestion and different reflexes and lower that when we get to the digestive system, so on and so forth. Okay. So these are much more complex, but we'll get into all of them later on the semester. I'll run through once again those 5 components of what we'd call now an autonomic reflex arc. First of the 5 are the receptors. Since the receptors just give me the distal end, the dendrites of a sensory neuron, responding to a stimulus, producing a change that will ultimately trigger a nerve impulse. Now, in the case of the stimulus, in this case, it's going to be typically an internal stimulus, a change internally, whereas with the somatic reflexes that we talked about the other day, like stepping on a tack, that's an external stimulus, okay, coming from outside the body, okay. These receptors involved with autonomic reflex arcs are usually classified as interoceptors, and we'll get into those more in our next lecture. When we talk about sensations and sensory receptors, we call them interoceptors because they're located in our interior. So places like inside the body, inside our organs, inside your blood vessels, monitoring, different things in different conditions internally. They become active, which results in an action potential or nerve impulses traveling into the CNS via sensory neurons, where synapsing occurs in the gray matter, which acts as the integrating center. Okay. The integrating center is the processing center made up of interneurons within the CNS that can relay those signals from the sensory neurons to motor neurons. Okay. I would highlight this next sentence. The main integrating centers for most autonomic reflexes are in your hypothalamus and your brainstem. So those very complex things like blood pressure, digestion, urination, those various control conditions, most of the time the integrating, the processing is taking place in your hypothalamus or your brainstem. Okay, which should make sense. We learned the other day your hypothalamus is the major regulator of your autonomic nervous system. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense that we'd send the signals there to process and perform autonomic functions. Some autonomic reflexes, for example, urination and defecation, actually utilizes the spinal cord. So the integration takes place down in the spinal cord, and we don't have to send the signal up to the brain and then back down to help with regulating, peeing and pooping, those 2 processes. Okay. Now, in the case of the somatic reflex arcs that we saw the other day, we only had one neuron that was going to carry the signal all the way out to skeletal muscle. But as we just learned, both Tuesday and today, no matter if it's sympathetic or parasympathetic, to get to the effectors, it takes two autonomic neurons, what we call the preganglionic and the postganglionic. And that's why it says motor neurons, not just one, propagate nerve impulses along a preganglionic and then a postganglionic neuron, which then carries the signal to the effector. And as we've really been hammered in, and I've hammered it in to you guys, hopefully by now you know whenever it's autonomic, we're talking smooth muscle, cardiac muscle glands, which elicit the actual change or response. Typically, those complex autonomic reflexes and changes elicited by your autonomic nervous system are done without our conscious perception. Okay, regulating digestion, making urine, regulating blood pressure. We don't even know those things are happening. We just know that they are happening, and it's thanks to, that subconscious control. Okay. As previously mentioned, the major control and integrating center of your autonomic nervous system is the hypothalamus. And so it does all these things in response to changes, and those changes are detected by sensor receptors and provide sensory input for things like visceral functions, olfaction, which is a fancy word for smell, gestation, which is a fancy word for taste. Also receives input for changes in things like temperature, blood osmolarity, which is just water levels, and then levels of various substances in the blood. So whether that's like calcium, could be oxygen, could be carbon dioxide, could be blood glucose, many other things. Okay. Now, not sensory, but can help change autonomic stuff will be signals coming from the limbic system relating to emotions. Thinking back to our last lecture, we learned that the nickname for your limbic system is the emotional brain, and it regulates emotions like anger and pleasure and fear and contentment. Okay. Well, how the heck and why the heck does your emotions affect autonomic function? Well, think about what happens to your body like when you get really angry. Is that just really an emotional response? Or does it result in physical things to your body? Okay. Does your heart rate go up? Does your blood pressure go up? Do you sometimes cry? Do you sometimes scream? Does your face get red? Do you start sweating? Okay. Those are physical changes to your body. Those are autonomic things as a result of an emotion. So the limbic system can influence visceral things, even though it's emotion that does affect organ functions. Okay? And as a result of any of those input signals, the hypothalamus sends output information to influence autonomic centers in your brainstem and the spinal cord. Not that I'm going to ask you to know this, but posterior and lateral parts of the hypothalamus help control your sympathetic division. Anterior medial parts of the hypothalamus control the parasympathetic. Okay, and with that said, we are now officially done with unit number 2.